every CMS needs some form of database where the content will be stored so that the administrators and the editors can update the content on their own in the CMS itself. And now we have arrived at the biggest part of Model View Controller, the MVC, the model itself. And since this is the biggest part, we will make it in several videos and explain several concepts along the way. And here we have the hard-coded articles from our controllers. And as mentioned, we need a database so that this is not hard-coded here. And the administrators, when we have the administrator part of our application, which is usually the biggest part and most complex part of the CMS, then we will have editors log in and change their content. So it cannot be hard-coded here. So we need to create a database. But before we do that, I've noticed that our CSS is not working anymore. And that is because if you open the console, we can see that there are several messages implying that the integrity attribute for the resources, our Bootstrap CSS, are wrong. So the resource has been blocked. And the easiest way to fix that, of course, is to change the integrity attribute to the correct value for these CSS and JS files. And that is in our static page. It is in our layout, default layout, right? And here we can see one of those integrity attributes. You can copy the new integrity attribute from the Bootstrap website. However, I'm just going to delete it because it's much easier to keep this tutorial working. So let me just remove all the reference to the integrity attributes, and might as well remove this cross-origin anonymous. And if I refresh now, I can see the CSS is back online and our website looks a bit prettier. So let's create a database, and I'm using PHP here. However, you can use any client that you like. The PHP just comes with XAMPP and it works as I need it to. So I will create one database, in this case called Darwin CMS. By the way, this CMS is called Darwin because it will evolve all the time. And here I will make one database, or one table, named pages with 3 columns. And the field it needs are the ID as being as integer and primary key auto increment. The next field is title, which will be varchar with 255, for example. And the content, that will be text. And now we have our table in our database where we are going to store the pages. And since this is the object-oriented tutorial, we are going to make one object called page. And we are going to actually put it into one folder named model. By the way, the model part does not mean that you need to have a module folder. You can name the folder wherever you want. The MVC is more about the structural organization of the application, not the file structure itself. So even this source folder and this model folder and the services folder, that's all the model of the application, regardless of the folder name. And this page will be inside this model. And now this class is going to represent one page in our CMS. So it is basically a simplified version of the active record, the ORM pattern. And we will create 3 fields here. One that is the ID of the page, one field that is the title of the page, and one field that is the content itself that is going to be displayed. And we also need some method that we will use to actually find the page that we are looking for. If you remember, we have the home page, the contact page, the about us page, and there will be much more pages because that's the CMS, the content management system. It will have a lot of pages, a lot of content. And one easy way to do that is to have one public method named find by ID, for example, and it will accept the ID of the page that we want to fetch from the database and that we want to work with. And here we would need to connect to the database in order to get the information that's actually stored in the database, right? So we will create one database connection and we will use the PDO for that. And let's see what the PHP documentation says about the PDO. And here we can see one way to connect to the database. My database is called Darwin CMS. It's on the local host. Default, I am just using the default user, which I'm hoping that you are not. And let's exit here just to see if our connection is working. So die. And now all that we need to do is to use this page object to find our page from the database. And to do that, we need to write an SQL, which will basically select from pages where ID equals to ID that we are passing in. And we need to prepare this statement. And then we are going to execute with our IDs. Actually, I will split this so that we have the statement as well. Prepare, and then we are going to run the statement execute, because we are going to need this statement to fetch our data. And for now, let's just var dump this page data to see what is in it, if we are reaching the database at all. In order to do that, we need to, let me close all of other pages. We need to go into our home page, and instead of this hard-coded variables here, we need to use our newly created page object. Let's just include it into index PHP model page. And I see that this template is a lowercase, so we will actually need to change that one to rename that to the uppercase, so that each file that is a class starts with an uppercase so that it matches the class name. And now in our home page, let's create one page object. And let's find by ID the page number 1. And if you remember, our database is empty, so let's put some data into our database by giving the home page title and content. And if I call the home page now, let's see what happens. Nothing happens because I'm on the contact. And on the home page, we see that data coming from the database, right? Home page title. Let's just check it and let's rename it home page title from database, just so that we are sure that our data is coming actually from the database, right? Now let's continue with our page object and let's update all these fields here that we created. So after we find by ID, we are going to say this ID equals to page data. Let's see what the page data returns. So it gives us the ID associated array value or the key. And we'll do the same for the title, same from the content. If I remove this var dump here and I go to home page, now we should remove these variables here, and instead of this one, we need to pass our variables page object as a key and our newly created object page as a value. And we're going to use this page object inside our template rather than parsing it here. If I refresh, there is an error, and that is because the static page has not been updated to work with the object. It's still trying to work with fields. So if I go to our static page, instead of echo title, we are going to echo page object title. Same for the content. Now if we try that one, it works great. And we are basically connected to the database. We have our model and we have our primitive active record pattern. Now this breaks some of the good practices. However, it is allowing us to progress easily throughout the course and also show why some of the practices exist in the first place, why some of the patterns exist, and also what problems are they solving. So stay tuned for next episodes where we are going to fine-tune and improve this code and show some of the common pitfalls of object-oriented programming. And this is one way to do it, and we can continue like this. However, if you remember, our plan on the homepage controller is not only to display the page data, but also to get some SEO data, get some page data, get some additional configuration data. And if we, for each object in our application, in this case the page, but if we have something like a news article or something like a FAQ article or contact page or some specific model here, If in each of those we connect to the database, then we are in big trouble because the connection to the database is quite expensive operation, and we ideally want to connect only once to the database in our application. So how can we do that? Well, we can of course move this connection to the index somewhere in our bootstrap of our application. This is much better because now we have one connection that is inside our index page, and we have also cleaned our page model so that it is a bit more solid, or it means that it's following the good principles in a way that it has a single responsibility. It is only worrying about getting the data and manipulating the data for the page from the database rather than taking care of the connection to the database as well. So this works a bit better. However, now we have another challenge. We need to pass this database handler from the index through our controller here. So we need to give it here, and then in our homepage controller, we need to go to the controller and put it here inside the constructor, then go back to homepage controller and then provide it to the page object itself. And it is not ideal solution because then we are restricting controllers so that they must get the database connection. It can happen that some controllers do not need database connection at all. And also passing that data all the way around is a bit difficult to follow where the objects are going and where are they coming from. And also, in case that we need to redirect from one controller to another controller in a single connection, in a single call, we will have to pass database multiple times, potentially opening multiple database connections. And we do not want to do that. We want to keep one database connection to a single and one and only database connection. So Singleton can help us preventing having multiple connections here. So the non-Singleton approach makes it possible for us to have one resource that should be only one multiple times so that we can suddenly get multiple instances of that one object, and that is basically something that we don't want in our case of the database. And the reason is that we are allowing a new database object to be created on multiple places. And if you suddenly get multiple people working on the project, you basically don't have control of what they can do with this object. Somebody might do it by accident or by not knowing what is the right way, and suddenly you have multiple connections, and that takes quite a lot of time to debug and to find out why is some page slow or why is database struggling when you get a bit more traffic in your application. So the Singleton helps us here by making sure that we can only get one instance of our database object. So it allows that you can have one class and only one single object made from that one class for your entire application, which is actually useful for database connection here, as we want to connect to database only once. And this is, or it was the most popular pattern that everybody wanted when the object-oriented got introduced in PHP, because this is the closest thing to the procedural programming, meaning that you don't have to think about the scope of these classes, as Singleton classes or objects are just there when you need them, as the functions were before the object-oriented programming. And it's usually better to use dependency injection instead of a simple Singleton. However, I think that it's useful that you know it, as you might encounter it in some application. And even modern frameworks and applications like Laravel, for example, it has a Singleton binding method in a service container, as it has its purpose. Although in Laravel it works a bit different, so it addresses some of the concerns that plain and simple Singleton has. Singleton, however, comes with some disadvantages. And the main one is that it can be difficult to control throughout application, as it doesn't have a clearly defined scope. You do need to manually hunt it down. It also breaks a bit a single principle, in a sense that the class is both creating instances in the getInstance method, and it is providing the functionality by allowing you to query the database and to actually connect to the database. And you might argue that the Singleton is not a bad thing per se, but it introduces dependencies that will make your life more difficult, as it sort of works like a global function, but in a class. It is therefore more difficult to test programmatically, especially if you include it in some other classes directly instead of injecting it as dependency. It's not impossible, but it's a bit difficult. So Singletons have their place in my opinion, but you just need to think about its traps, you need to be aware of the drawbacks, and you should use it when you absolutely must have only one object of that kind. Although in PHP this is sort of not truly single object, as each server requests will make its own object. But a bad example of using singleton is if you're trying to go the easy route and you just want to avoid dependency injection, passing some object, and you just want to quick and dirty access to some objects from your models and from some of your classes and objects. Do not do that. Do not write bad code on purpose. So we will now make one singleton in practice in our code. But does this explanation make any sense? Do you have any questions about it? I kindly ask you to like this video and subscribe to my channel if you really like it. And I would also like to know how many of you are actually following this series and coding along in this tutorial. If you are following, please write me in comments at what stage of progress you are. Are you working as a developer? Have you just started with object-oriented programming? Are you more interested in the CMS or the OOP or these presentations? Should I explain things in more details, or is this the speed that suits you? Since we are so early in the project, I can easily change the course of action, so I can explain some things better so that you can get more out of it. New comments are the only feedback I have, so please make your voice heard. Also, I am working on a full course on all popular design patterns that is coming out very soon. And if you would like a free preview of the course when it's ready, as well as some discounts in the beginning, please go to applicableprogramming.com and register your email in the form, so that way I can send you the link once I record some lessons. There is a link to the website in the description, so let's make one singleton in our application. And the best place for that one is maybe in a source, where you can have one database connection class. Now there are several things that we need to take care when we are creating a singleton, one of which is to make our class final. And that will basically prevent anyone extending our class and thus making a new instance of it. We don't want to do that. We want this class to be final as it is. So database connection. And in order to get a singleton type of object and class, we also need to use the static fields like an instance in this case, which will be initialized as null, and I will show you why right now. And we also need one field that is also static that will contain our actual database connection in this case. So this instance field will contain the object instance, the class instance, and the connection. That is where our database connection, that DBH database handler, will be the one that we have from the home page, this one. And in order to get that instance, we need one method that is also going to be static, in this case public. Let's call it getInstance. And this one will basically return us the instance. You need to use self here, because this class will never be initialized as an object. But before it just returns it, it will check if this instance is still null. It means if the instance has ever been created. So if the instance is null, it will actually create it. So it will create itself as a new instance. And it will become clear very soon why. And now there are a few more things to make sure that our database is actually singleton, so that we protect it from creating multiple objects. And one way to do that is to override the constructor to make it private. I'm missing one parenthesis here. And by making the constructor private, we are sure that nobody can actually construct any objects out of this class. And there are a few more methods that we need to take care of. One is the clone method. We do the same here, we just overwrite it and make it private. And the same for the wake-up method. The wake-up method is used if somebody is serializing our objects to maybe store them in a session or database or whatever. But when you do unserialize or the wake-up of the object or a class, the PHP will actually create a new object instance, and we don't want that. That's why we are overwriting the wake up. And now we basically have the instance control under control here, so we are just making a new instance and always returning the existing instance if this object or this class, this method is being called multiple times. That is basically making sure that we get only one instance of our object class. But we now need to connect to the database, and we need to make one public static function. Static means that we don't need an object to call this method. Let's call it a connect, because why not? And we'll just pass some parameters like the host of the database, database name, user, and the password. And then we are just basically going to store into this connection. So it will be the self connection. We are going to store our connection from the index, this one. This is what we are basically making. So let's move that one here. This is connection string, and we're going to grab this string and just adapt it so that it is using these variables for the host, for the database, the user, and the password. Marvelous. Now we can just remove this connection to a database, and we are going to connect using our database connection. So let's just include our database connection here, and let's connect to it. So we need the database connection, and we'll just call the connect. For now, we are going to hardcode variables here. They might come from some settings file or some setting methodology that we have. For now, it will be here. As mentioned before, this whole bootstrap and this will be moved to auto include out of the index PHP file. Database name, and the user is root, password is empty. Now, when we are connected to this database, we need some way to get this method, to get this connection, because if you remember, it's private. So we need one method here, public, that will just return our connection, get connection. This can be done on multiple different ways. You can get it from here, you can make it public, but it just complicates things a bit. Then you need to take care of some other things. This one works just fine. So we will return self connection, right? And then we can get this connection here, or rather than here as we did before, we can now use our controllers, and we can let our controllers get the connection when they need it. So here in our controllers, now we can ask for the database instance, or the database handler instance in this case. So we get the instance here, and from the instance, we can now ask for get connection itself. So this will be database connection, and we can pass this connection now to our page, which will then accept it via constructor. And we always know that this page needs a database connection. So that way we can say that this will be one private field, database connection, and set it. And then if everything is good, we can just use this database connection or database handler here to prepare our statement. Now let's just try out of curiosity to refresh the home page. And we can see that we still get data from the database. We can confirm that by changing the title in the database, and we can see that it's responding. Now we are basically back to beginning, but we are avoiding to pass this database connection throughout our controllers. However, from the controller, we can get the instance of database connection, and then we can pass it to our page. The controllers are not perfectly object-oriented in this case, as they are suddenly introducing some dependencies. They should be cleaner, but we are making sure that we have only one connection to the database. And we can see that if we go to the get instance into our database connection, and if we just do a short dump here, where we are connecting to the database, if we refresh, we can see that we have only one connection to the database. Let's test that by getting multiple instances and multiple connections in our controller. And even if we are going 4 instances and we are asking for 4 connections, we can see that we only have one connection to the database. And that is the whole point of Singleton, to make sure that we are connecting to the database only once. So our get instance, it will either create one instance or it will return it multiple times. And we can see that here, if you go to our database connection, you can use the debugger that we used in previous episodes to xdebug to trace where the code is going. However, I will just simply dump this so that we can see, and I can say we are creating a instance, and I can say we are returning the instance. If I refresh now, we can see that we are connecting to the database, we are creating an instance, and then we have 4 times returning the instance. So still the instance is created only once and the connection to the database is made only once, which is very important. Now let me remove these dumps. And if I go to About Us page, it is broken, and that is because, if you remember, the static page is now changed so that it is expecting the object rather than the simple variables that we had before. So let's quickly fix the About Us page so that it works the same way as the home page. I don't need these connections here. And while I'm here, I will fix a few more things. I need first to get this About Us page content inside the database. So I will just insert this page quickly. And since we are in database now, this is the page 2, our About Us page. Let's see if it works. And the About Us page is working again. However, we are not hard-coding it anymore. It's coming from the database as expected. While I'm here, I noticed that the About Us controller file name is not correct. So let me rename that one. And let's fix that into our public index as well. So it will be About Us controller. Let's see if it works. It works. The contact page is now broken, so I will quickly fix that one, and I will just speed up so that you don't have to wait for me. And since we have 3 pages here, I will put them all in database. And we will do the same thing for the Contact Us landing page, or the content of the Contact Us form. And if you remember our Contact Us page, now it's working, but we have already submitted the form. Let me clear the session. And now we have the content form, but we don't have the data above because we are using the Contact Us template, which should now also be changed so that it works with the object. That is this one. And instead of title, we need page object title, and the same for content. And our contact page is working. We have the thank you message, and if we try to submit already, we have you have already submitted the form. However, all of this data is now coming from the database, so we basically have a dynamic content management system working. It is getting the data from the database and displaying it dynamically. How about that? It was very easy, as I mentioned. And I will include this database into the source file on the GitHub so that you can play with it. You don't have to type it manually. And here is a joke for you.